Well, it's now time for our panel discussion with four speakers whose expertise, knowledge and innovation is going to be put to the test as we continue to explore the key themes of this conference, which include digital transformation and disruption, the future of rail, as well as the role of regulators and authorities in all of this. And just to explain how the panel session will work, I'm going to invite all the speakers up in just a moment. Each speaker has 5 minutes to deliver their thoughts and ideas from the comfort of their chair. After each speaker has spoken, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. And then once we've heard from all four speakers, I'm going to moderate a panel discussion, a short one, before I open up to the floor. So the last 10, 15 minutes of the panel discussion, it'll be a great opportunity for you to ask questions. And we've got a couple of roving mics to pick up your thoughts and ideas. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage Matthew Baldwin, Deputy Director General for Mobility and Transport for the EU Commission, Peter Marshall, Director of Supply Chain of Dow Chemicals, Jürgen Wilder, CEO of DB Cargo. I'm hoping Zvi Schreiber is here, CEO of Freightos. He's here. Big round of applause, please, for our gentlemen. Nice to have you here. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. And if you were at last night's dinner, you'll have seen that the presenters there managed to perform a dance routine with a plant flower plot on their heads. So shall we get them to do that or not? I think it'd be quite entertaining. Or maybe you should just do your presentations straightforward. But it was a very good evening, actually. So our first panelist that we're going to hear from is Matthew Baldwin, who brings with him a wealth of experience in trade, aviation and international transport affairs. Now, Matthew, as I mentioned earlier, is currently with the EU Commission as their Deputy Director General at the Department for Mobility and Transport, otherwise known as DG Move, which I think you're trying to be trendy there, aren't you? A nice title.
Yep. And failing.
Indeed. Matthew has held this role since 2016, and I was looking at the website yesterday, is responsible for Directorate C, D and E, which basically translates into being responsible for land transport, waterborne and aviation directorates, although I appreciate that you feed into A and B, and those, for the avoidance of doubt, A talks about an efficient, sustainable, safe and secure single transport area, as well as feeding into Directorate B, which focuses on innovation, innovative and sustainable transport, because it's quite confusing if you don't explain that.
It's confusing for me,
I know,
yes.
it is, isn't it? So, Matthew, your 5 minutes starts now.
Well, thank you, Nadine. I'm not sure if there's a panel or a panel game with the 5 minutes, and I'm going to be interrupted if I repeat or transgress in other ways. First, I wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me, Hupac, and happy birthday. It does actually seem like a very happy birthday for Hupac, to judge from last night's lovely dinner, and not least because it seems from all the data that I've seen, you're making a real success out of this thorny business we call intermodal transport. And indeed a real success in terms of moving heavy freight off the roads and onto rail in particular. Some astonishing figures. You've got modal share now up to 71% for rail, for freight in Switzerland. Now, yes, as Patrick's pointed out, that's probably driven a bit by the tax system, but that's a huge vote of confidence in Swiss rail. And anyone with an elementary knowledge of Swiss geography knows just how important that is. I want to make 4 points on that in relation to the European perspective. What we call by this modal shift in our terrible transport jargon, is an explicit and key target for the European Commission. It has been since 2011. It matters if we believe in the decarbonisation agenda and the contribution that transport can and must make to that. It matters if we believe in Europe and Europe's economy and in the role of a more effective and efficient transport system to play in that, particularly on the freight side. And you're right, by the way, Hupac, in setting this conference up, to put this in the apocalyptic terms, which Patrick didn't necessarily put it in such apocalyptic terms in his presentation, is can rail survive? It is a tough world out there, and our figures in Europe are not nearly as good on the rail side. And to put it more bluntly to you, multimodal transport cannot be a romantic business. It cannot be either a dream world of the systemic planners. It has to be practical. to let you into a dirty secret, which you all know, many shippers in this room. You do not wake up in the morning and say, how many different transport modes can I use to take my goods from Berlin to Portugal? You, the shipper, want the cheapest, the most effective, the most reliable method. And indeed, as Patrick pointed out a moment ago, the key word in your mind when you wake up and you're about to order the shipping route is trust. Who's going to deliver on that? And let's be very clear, if freight by road is easier, if freight by road is more convenient and doesn't carry all its external costs, by the way, we will continue to see a trend away from rail and towards road in the European Union and elsewhere. So we've got to make multimodal transport across Europe a practical proposition. We'll do everything we can to help with that. 2018 for the European Commission is Year of Multimodality. To use Patrick's technique, how many people knew that already? We were designating 2018 as Year of Multimodality. Practically nobody. We have our work cut out for us. We're looking at an extensive range of different initiatives, from the legislative to the publication. And we've had suggestions from many in this room, I think from all those people who just put their hands up, in fact. And yes, it will include revision of our famous Combined Transport Directive as part of that. Third point, for multimodality to work, a lot's going to come down, of course, to the performance of the non-road modes. It's not just about the interconnections, it's about how well they're delivering, and especially, of course, rail freight. I'm sure we'll talk about more of this in the panel, but I cannot resist drawing to attention this, because here we are at the heart of the Rhine-Alpine freight corridor. So much has been done, great figures for 2016, congratulations on that. But I'm sure you would agree, so much still to be done in terms of making rail freight competitive, just in this corridor. Yes, we've had the Rotterdam Declaration. Yes, we've had a very encouraging sector statement on 10 points you're determined to follow up yourselves to make the system more competitive. And you're very committed to that. You're not quite as committed as my boss, Commissioner Bulc, who is becoming increasingly concerned and increasingly strident about the need for rail freight to get its act together. And she's asked to hear from us collectively, her bureaucrats and you, the industry, to hear a progress report at the Rail Freight Days we're organizing in Vienna in December. And so finally, for this all to happen, you've mentioned digitalization. Yes, I think that's probably the key critical vector overall. Perhaps digitalization will put an end to the bizarre question, again, which Patrick just raised, which is, where is my train? When you have a mobile phone that can track where my truck, where my flight, where my ship is, maybe it's time for the rail sector to catch up with that. Perhaps digitalization will help us on our path to the full deployment of the ERTMS, our new snazzy signal system. It's overdue. And perhaps, as Hans-Jörg has also pointed out, it'll help us with success towards a much better estimated time of arrival and timetabling. But let me be clear, digitalization will not on its own solve all the problems. That will only happen when there's an extensive and clear commitment from the sector itself to make rail freight great again, to coin a recent phrase, to make rail freight once again the centerpiece of our single market. And only then will we succeed. Looking forward to our discussion, Nadine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. As we heard Patrick talk earlier, a big advocate of rail being energy efficient and for many is deemed as the most eco-friendly transport mode. So if it is to remain competitive, how can the Commission actually help businesses to fully take advantage of digitalisation and all that it has to offer? Let's put your Commissioner's head's comments aside for the moment. What can the Commission do for the industry?
That's a very good question. I mean, part of it is not pretending we have all the answers ourselves. I think a lot of what the Commissioner has to do, and is doing, by the way, is setting the right framework. Commissioner Bulc likes to talk about there being a digitalization layer to everything we're trying to do on transport. So we're organizing fora. We have the Digital Transport and Logistics Forum, which in itself is generating tremendous work on electronic transport documents. No more piles and piles of documents to get your goods through. Let's make real progress. And not just in the maritime sector, on the rail freight side as well. We have, in this terrible jargon, we have interoperability. How do we move forward in terms of the TAF and the TAP data? Data exchange is fundamental. Data, of course, is the new hard currency that we use in the world. So there's a lot we can do to encourage things that are that can be done. And if you look at the 10 priorities that the sector adopted in Rotterdam, so many of them have directly to do with the digital system. Timetabling, estimated time of arrival, I mentioned both of those. Better integration of the logistics chain, better use of our overall infrastructure, ERTMS, again. There's a lot of things we can do. We want to set the framework, we want to encourage you, we want to work with you, but at the end, it's about the sector taking its digitalization responsibilities.
Now, you also mentioned about the Rhine-Alpine corridor, which constitutes one of the busiest freight routes of Europe. In particular, I've been picking up on the fact there's a worrying delay in the removal of productivity bottlenecks along the Rotterdam-Genoa freight corridor, and there's been all sorts of observations. One in particular, the parameters of 2,000-ton train weight with one engine, 740-metre train length and 4-metre profile are the basic prerequisites for a cost-effective operation of combined traffic. So my comment to you is the removal of bottlenecks in the infrastructure has got to be the top priority for the Commission. Is it one of your top priorities?
Completely. I mean, this is, a system is as strong as its weakest link, and you can have the best corridor in the world, and if there's one bottleneck, it's not going to work. So we proposed in what we call our 10T regulation to address all of these things. So axle loads, line speeds, and this famous question of length of trains, and of course ERTMS. And we've got now a commitment within each corridor to deploy by 2030. Now, sounds like a long way off, but in fact it's tomorrow in terms of some of the investments that need to be done, investments on all of these things. And there's a lot of devil lying in the detail. On the 740-meter question, for example, Germany and Belgium have got special permission to use 740-meter trains, but only during off-peak hours. I mean, this is ridiculous. We've got to be able to move forward and have them run the whole day. We're almost there on the axle load question. We're almost there on the line speed question. ERTMS, I could talk to you for hours about, not always happily, but basically we'll be fine on the North Sea Med corridor down to Basel, and we should be fine on the Rhine-Alpine side, except for just 2 bottlenecks. That will be done by 2023, completed by 2030. Again, good but not good enough. And on the last thing, I'm sorry to go on at such length, but this really does drive me nuts. On the last thing, everyone in this room will know about the significance of the loading gauge, which is basically how you get big multimodal things through awkwardly shaped tunnels. And we know this has to be addressed. We made the proposals to the member states, and the member states in their wisdom said, no, we're not going to address that. This is not going to be part of the 10T requirements. And again, this risks being then the weakest link in this chain that we're trying to develop. And we've got to address it. And we are looking now at different ways in which we can drive, in the terrible jargon, the P400 intermodal profile.
Lovely.
The loading gauge, which can make this corridor actually work.
So we'll come back to that point about it seems to be national interests over and above the region's interests or making the corridor super efficient. And there are certain countries ahead of the game who get it, as you mentioned already, others, off-peak hours. I mean, that sounds ridiculous from someone who's outside of the industry, but we'll come back to that point. Thank you very much to you, Matthew. Well, next up, I'm delighted to say we've got Peter Marshall from Dow Chemical, and Peter is the Director of Supply Chain Operations in EMEA, which is the India bit of it, for the Dow Chemical Company. Obviously does the rest of EMEA as well, but you've got India under your portfolio. And I know it's a role you've held for the last 5 years or so, and I've worked with Peter quite a few times now at EPCA in the chemical industry, so it's good to see you again. And he's responsible for Dow's logistics activities right across the EMEA region, which includes all modes of transportation, warehousing, marine terminal operations, international trade compliance, and transportation safety and security. So it sounds like you've got a lot under your plate there, Peter. And he's also been with Dow since 1983, so I'm presuming you're getting a carriage clock soon or something for that length of service, and has worked in R&D, manufacturing and supply chain roles for 6 different locations, so truly international. And Peter, you have 5 minutes to talk about Dow Chemical and how you use intermodal today, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nadine, and good morning, everyone. And also, I'd like to thank Hupac for the invite, the wonderful evening last night, and above all else, actually, the the fantastic service that's actually the backbone of a lot of the things we do when we move products around. Hopefully that will become clearer as we go through the presentation. So first of all, what I wanted to do, let me see if I can make this work, yeah. Some of you may not be so familiar with the Dow Chemical Company or with the chemical industry, so just a few key facts. You can see the various dots on the map there. We truly are a multinational global player. Around about $50 billion of US dollars of sales. In this region, 14 billion. And that amounts to a lot of shipments. So round about 600,000 truck shipments per year from our manufacturing sites to go to our customers. We're a B2B player, so we're not so well known. We don't sell consumer products. We're further back in the value chain, which obviously has some implications in terms of how we move products around, but obviously we are still impacted by the changing world. The consumer drives some of the things that Patrick spoke about. So how do we use intermodal today? One of the key points is that each of our major manufacturing sites, we actually have an intermodal terminal on the site. And that's in many cases is multimodal. It's rail, road, but also a water connection too. And just to illustrate that a little bit with this map that shows, particularly on the north-south axis, if you take our major production sites in Europe, in fact our largest outside the US, in Lucerne in the Netherlands, pretty much 90% of shipments to Italy today go intermodal. And this is where, thanks again to Hupac for supporting the service providers, the transport companies that we work with to make all of that happen. By contrast, you can see to Germany, it's a much lower percent, shorter routes, etc. But intermodal does play a key part for us. And the reasons for that are pretty clear. Some of these points have been discussed already, but perhaps in addition, some of the other things that intermodal transport does for us as a producer and a shipper, certain operational flexibility. The container yard at either end is a storage facility, and by bringing that product to Italy in this intermodal way, we have local stocks that can be called off by the customers, improve service, etc. The benefits in terms of energy, lower carbon, etc., are very, very clear. One of the other aspects that we look at these days is the growing trend of difficulty of attracting younger people into driving, and through this intermodal setup, it means that typically the drive is much shorter, much local. The driver can get to go home in the evening rather than going long distance drives. So it has an important impact. It can also minimize some of the language barriers that we see at our sites. So intermodal is very much important for us, and I think for other companies similar to ourselves. It has its challenges too. Quite clearly, as we saw, longer distances like to Italy works out well. Shorter distances, it's not quite as attractive. And I think Matthew made the point, this is not based on some emotional decision that we use greener methods of transport or intermodal or whatever. It comes down to the hard facts of getting the right, obviously safety being the number one thing as a chemical producer, but then getting the right balance of service and cost. And so it has to pay for its own lunch, so to speak. One of the things that we see with overall with intermodal, with rail operations in general, is more disruption due to various actions. You could maybe say with the weather that's less in the control of the industry, but certainly perhaps more strike-prone than others. And an overall difference in the service mindset we see between, say, pure road operations and intermodal. And then just to mention the final point there around supply chain visibility, which is very critical to us. And we are working actually across all modes of transport to get this end-to-end visibility in place. My commercial colleagues frequently remind me or chastise me if I order my package on Amazon, I can see exactly where it is. Why can't you do that with my shipments? Yeah. And it's a fair point. It's something that we're working on. Yeah. So in conclusion, intermodal is very important for us, but there are some challenges in terms of taking it to the next level.
Thank you to Peter, everybody. Thank you, Peter. Because we're looking at the future of rail as well, Peter, could you set the context of the audience of how important rail is as a transport mode for Dow?
It's absolutely critical, and from two perspectives as well, not purely the intermodal one. We also use a lot of rail, pure rail traffic, particularly between our sites, moving raw materials around, or to other customers that are also more at the commodity end of the value chain. And that means that we're shifting typically dangerous goods that we'd rather see on the tracks than on the roads in that mode. And it's absolutely critical for those types of operations. And then on the other hand, yes, as our way of getting the right service cost balance to numerous other customers across the region and making use of intermodal. So we use rail in both of those ways.
I mean, those points you've got on the slide there are very well made, but what ultimately is preventing Dow from increasing its use of rail going forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of it comes back to the shorter distance, making that cost effective, et cetera, which is hopefully something that over time can improve. There are still barriers when, even when there's a very good case and we take it to a particular business unit that we should switch something to intermodal, there's often an initial reaction of, yeah, but the service and, is it reliable and what happens when the tunnel's blocked? And so there's still a bit of a reputation gap there and perceptions that need to be broken down. And in part a reality that the service is not as flexible as, say, a typical truck operation.
And just finally on that point, that end-to-end supply chain visibility, I know you gave the example of Amazon, but how will that translate truly for Dow to know that it's been successful? And when do you see that end-to-end visibility actually taking place and happening? So it's just business as usual, so you don't have to put that on your slide.
Right, yeah, it's, first of all, really, the visibility is one thing, it's maybe the starting point, but it's actually what you do with the visibility that really counts. And that's where the connection is back to the service component here. You'd like to not just see that you have a problem and something is stuck, you'd like to be able to find opportunities to work around this and have a service set up that enables you to do that. So kind of resiliency in the supply chain and options that you can then, through the use of real-time data, that you can action and make something happen. When will it happen? Well, we're working very hard across all of our modes of transport to put in real-time visibility, and probably, I would say, in the next 2 years.
Because you mentioned about the recruitment of people. Millennials want this to be just business as usual, otherwise there's a danger they won't be attracted into the industry. So it's a real game changer. It needs to happen, doesn't it?
That's true, and often the best people to get to work on these types of things, obviously maybe with some guidance for a few people with less hair or grey hair, but getting the millennials actually engaged in this type of technology, I mean, that's what excites them. They typically, I learn how to use my iPhone from my kids, and I guess quite a few of us are like that, so we have to engage them.
Nodding his head as well in agreement there. Thank you very much, Peter, and we'll come back to you later. Thank you again. So next up, welcome to, give them a round of applause. Why not? There you go, Peter. Next up, delighted to welcome Jürgen Wilder, who's currently chairman of the management board and CEO at DB Cargo. A dual role I believe you've held for 18 months, and DB Cargo, as I've shortened version, is Europe's largest freight railway. Previously, Jürgen was with Siemens Group. I know you've worked with them for a number of years in the railway industry, and that included being Siemens CEO of the globally active unit for high-speed, intercity and regional trains, as well as locomotives. And in this role, you're also responsible for the construction of the new ICX. Is that the interstate Carrier Express. Is that what that stands for? Is it something else? Yeah, have I got that right? Because
that's right.
there's a few ICXs, but I thought it must be that
There's
one.
IC4 that was.
Okay, got it. And that's scheduled to begin operations in Germany. Is that towards the end of 2017? So at the end of this year. And notably, Jürgen is also successfully launched Siemens' entry into the North American locomotive market. So again, a huge amount of experience in the industry. So we're looking forward to hearing about the DB cargo approach when it comes to innovating mobility systems. So Jürgen, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, also from my side, happy birthday to Hupac, and very pleased to be here. I think it's a great event, and happy to be on this panel as well. So I guess we have heard earlier that rail systems sometimes suffer from a reputation that it might be not at the edge of the art, that it might be slow in innovation cycles, that there's a lot to catch up. I heard from Mr. Baldwin this morning, there's the impression that the rail sector wouldn't get its act together anymore or something like that.
Something rude, yeah.
Maybe something a little bit rude. And there's reasons for, on parts of it, a movement that might be slow compared to other sectors. And that is, of course, safety is the first priority, and safety always will be a first priority, and that's why innovation cycles on parts of it might be slow. On other parts of it, that is totally different. On other parts of it, there's great opportunity, I believe, where we can innovate in a totally different pace than traditionally seen from railroads. And I would like to refer to that a little bit. I mean, innovation in rail systems, what is the goal of it? The goal of it, if you compare it or if you summarize it in 3 items, first of all, I think it needs to lead to higher efficiency. It needs to lead to higher competitiveness of rail systems. That is one very important goal of innovation. The second is easy to use. The system needs to be easy to use. I got a question recently. When will it be, for example, as simple to ship, well, in that question it said bathroom appliances, for example, by a rail system compared to other means of transportation? It's a good question, and that's what we also in the rail sector need to tackle. And the third one is it needs to be indeed reliable, and it needs to be reliable not just that we say, okay, the train will arrive at a certain time somewhere, but it needs to be reliable in terms of tracking and tracing. We have said that before, knowing where the shipment is and being able to adjust own processes towards it. And towards those 3 things that need to be innovated and improved in rail systems, there's a lot of activities that currently also happen in the rail systems. So, for example, you can see on this slide a few of the keywords that I would briefly like to refer to. First of all, new interfaces towards customers. To be easier, to use that system easier, digital sales platforms that clearly supports what I said before, easy to use. Or integrated transport chains, yeah? Not only the ease of use, but also basically reliability. Having data at the interfaces of different systems. Is the train already at the next terminal? What can processes adjust to that maybe need to adjust to something if there's a delay or something like that? That is very important, and actually when we talk to customers, one of the most important things, tracking and tracing, that customers name as something that they need to see in rail systems. So that is something that is very important. Towards efficiency, and efficiency is so important. We have heard that also this morning in the speech of Patrick, where we have seen over the past few years a drastic decline basically in cost structures on road traffic, but an increase for several reasons, which I don't want to go into detail right now. We can maybe do it later. on the rail system. So there's a cost gap, a true cost gap that needs to be closed. And the rail system themselves and the rail companies themselves need to find measures in order to lower that cost structure. And one example, for example, is for sure longer and heavier trains that we have discussed about. That means we are more efficient. There is a less cost to be spent per tonnage of movement. There is, if I look at single wagon systems, for example, in Europe, then 30% of it comes from shunting yards. The shunting yards, if you look at shunting yards today, that is a very manual process. There's a lot of opportunity for automation. Also, automation doesn't refer only to the locomotives or shunting locomotives or the mainline locomotives, also essentially to all of the processes in the shunting yards. We believe there is future opportunity for cost reduction, that is for sure. Also on the asset side, if you look at intelligent wagons that supply data that can be evaluated, that tell the customers when did what wagon with what shipment basically get what physical impact on the way through the shunting yards. Might there be damage out of it? That has also something to do with tracking and tracing and supplying more information to the customers that might be very relevant to them. Preventive maintenance, another field that first of all increases reliability and second of all lowers costs of the rail system. We need to know in advance when parts in locomotives or other systems fail, so we can exchange them before they fail, which will increase the availability of equipment, locomotives and other equipment that we have in rail systems. So in summary, basically, we can say that at the end of the day, there is maybe a piece of rail that is closely related to safety that might move a little slower, but there's another piece of rail that really carries opportunities for the future in order to make it more efficient, as I said, be more competitive towards other modes of transportation, having in the future a lot of customers that say it got much easier to use than in the past. That is where we need to get. And then also the third one, which I mentioned, is reliability through more digitalization, knowing where my shipment is, tracking and tracing, and being more reliable in any case in delivering the trains and the goods. I think those are the three things that we need to work on. That costs investments, by the way. It costs a lot of investments to do that. And as rail companies, I'm fully aware we need to do our homework to get that efficiency. But then also, in order to fully close cost gaps to other modes of transportation, there's also a big discussion that is needed, and I'm fully convinced about that, about political frame conditions of rail freight in Europe, in order to make it a long-term, sustainable mode of transportation, which we all need in our economy. That's what I'm convinced about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jürgen. Thank you. Now, Jürgen, when I was doing my research into your business, I noticed that you've opened up a lab in Frankfurt this year, and the press release talked about DB Cargo playing a pioneering role when it comes to digitalization, a pioneering role when it comes to it. So what was the thinking behind launching the digital lab, and what innovations are you working on at the moment?
Well, it's exactly what I said before. We need to come to a point where we move faster towards innovation. And just by opening a lab, you won't get much faster by just opening a lab. But if you put together basically other ways of working, whether it is big data analysis and other things that we also can use in rail with sometimes new people that come from other sectors to attract them into such a lab environment, and combine that basically with the traditional knowledge that you also need of rail systems, that we believe we can move much faster than in our traditional way to do that. And that refers to speed, as I said, and the the side of rail system that should move faster also in the future. And that's where we said we invest into such a lab environment. We have several topics. I mentioned a few of them, whether it is predictive maintenance, data that we collect there, the analysis of that, or overarching other IT systems that make the whole chain of rail freight easier to use. We have, for example, on the fair in Munich that we had recently shown new interfaces to customers, how to make use rail easier, and that is things that we want to develop quickly in such an environment.
And to give it its full title, it's the House of Logistics and Mobility, or HOME. Just like this place is not the Transport Museum, it's the House of Transport, I hear. So that's the full title of it. So besides that digital transformation program, what else is DB Cargo doing to keep fit for the future?
Well, I mean, just last year and since about 1.5 years, we have launched a major program that is called Future of Rail, not just in DB Cargo, but also in Deutsche Bahn, with other fields of operations where we closely work together and also try to leverage or find levers which we are in the process of implementation right now in order to increase the quality of our service, in order to save money, increase the quality, and therefore foster growth. There's essentially for DB Cargo 5 or 6 levers that we are currently in the mode of implementation. We totally restructure basically our production system to make it fit for the future, to name one of those. And that's what we are in the middle of. We need to really drive that forward towards the end of this year, and then starting next year, really see the benefits out of those programs. That is very important.
And just very quickly, what is your focus and attention on thinking about automatic train operations? How realistic is that going to be?
Well, I mean, many people say, how difficult can it be? It's much easier than on the roads because you go on rail. Yeah, that is true. On one hand, there's of course a lot of things that needs to be done and considered in terms of homologation. But we have, from a technology point of view, we really are in a position, I think, that we can do the next step there. For example, we had already in 2016, last year, on a test track, an automated locomotive recognizing obstacles on the track, stopping automatically, recognizing other things, reacting as such. And technically, that is something that works today. Or we will have on another field, like I said, shunting yard, automation of shunting yards, where we look at shunting locomotives and introduce automated operations there. That is certainly in the focus of DB, and certainly for rail freight of DB Cargo, and we are moving along to get there to implement that on larger scales.
But do you get a sense there's going to be a lot of resistance, whether it's unions or the perception that it's unsafe? And just like airlines, pilots, the planes can pretty much fly themselves. The landing and the takeoff is important. Do you get a sense, though, that will never happen, though, because of those concerns?
Well, of course, there's all kind of those discussions. I mean, you could argue whether it is even safer than manual operation. I think we will get there eventually anyway. The other thing is, if you look at the really physically hard work in our shunting yards, for example, then we are more concerned that in the future, let's say in 10 years from now or something like that, we will have difficulties to get employees and to find employees performing that kind of work. So to get out of that situation, I think it is even necessary in order to get to a higher degree of automation, also in such environments, which also makes rail then, at the end of the day, more reliable. That is what I refer to as one of the goals.
Jürgen Wilder, everybody. Thank you very much, Jürgen. And if you could pass the clicker on it. And Ziv has been waiting very patiently there. Well, next up we have Ziv Schreiber, who's a software and internet entrepreneur and currently the CEO of Freightos, which is a logistics company, technology company, who's been billed as the disruptive transport service provider. If you, yes, I know, you're not going to be disruptive as a guest, but I think the content is going to be. And Freightos is quite simply shaking up the traditional market structures, bringing international freight online with their technology, helping some of the world's largest freight companies, retailers and manufacturers, as well as small businesses, to automate freight shipping. And interestingly, I know you've got a huge history when it comes to leading multiple tech companies, some of which I believe have been acquired by company giants, including IBM and GE. So a fantastic wealth of experience behind you. So here to share his thoughts and ideas on smooth shipping and so much more, a very warm welcome to you. The floor's yours.
Thank you very much, Nadine, and thanks, Hupac, for inviting me to your birthday party. And just a correction, we are not, in fact, a transportation service provider ourselves. Yeah. We facilitate other transportation providers, and I don't like to use the word disruption. We're partnering with the industry to modernize, I hope. Okay. Maybe I'll just start very briefly with my own story, how I got into this industry. I think many people here have been in the industry their whole lives. This is one of the industries when you meet someone, they say, I've been in the industry 20 years, I've been in the industry 30 years. People are proud of their long track record. But I'm actually a little bit newer in the industry, and I learned about it as a shipper. So in 2010, 2011, I was managing a smallish electronics company making power supplies for this kind of lights. And so we designed them in Israel, where I live, and we manufactured them in China, and we were shipping from China to the US and from China to Europe. And the thing that used to really annoy me as a shipper is I would call up my freight forwarder and say, I have a container or 3 pallets of power supplies in Shenzhen, China. I need to get them to Europe. I need to get them to US. And it would literally take 2, 3, 4 days just to get a price quote. And sometimes I would lose the business, while I was waiting for the price quote. And this really surprised me because I wasn't the first guy to ship something from China to Europe. This has been tried once or twice before, but I felt like I must be the first one because it was all so manual. So after I had the good luck to sell that business, I decided to get back into software, which is what I know and love, and to do software for freight forwarding and for logistics. Just to maybe emphasize the difference, if we compare, I like to compare logistics either to passenger travel or to the FedEx and integrators. And FedEx, maybe they have a slightly simpler business, but they have many of the same challenges that we have. They have to get it, from the door to the plane, and et cetera, et cetera. Typically, we've done a lot of research on this to confirm my own experience. Getting a price quote for shipping a container takes an average of more than 3 days, on average. An employee at a freight forwarder, on average, handles 40 shipments a year. And then there's hundreds of millions of dollars in mistakes as well. Compare that with FedEx, which in some ways is simpler, but not much. They have many of the same issues. You can get a price on the website, you can do a booking on the website, and an employee handles 11,000 packages a year. It's a very big difference. And of course, track and trace, which was already discussed before. Let me give you one more example. You mentioned, Jorgen, about the safety, but if you look at another industry which has safety issues, which is the airline industry, so they've got just as much safety issues. But do you know in which year you could electronically get a price for an airline seat and book that seat electronically? I wonder if anyone remembers which year.
Well, we've got a game. We're playing a game now. This is great, isn't it? Please join in. Which year?
I will tell you. 1964.
Okay.
1964, so that's when Sabre went live.
53 years ago.
And you still can't do that with most freight carriers, with most rail lines or airlines or ocean liners today.
And that was down to CETA, that the airline system, CETA, I think
it was originally American Airlines who started it.
Yeah, and then CETA was the collective.
It was called Sabre, I believe, and then it was
CETA,
expanded.
it was the,
anyway. So that's the background. That's what attracted me. I saw here an opportunity to help, play a part in modernizing this industry. So, our goal is to help freight forwarders and freight carriers to quote in a more automatic and online way, increase their win rate, lower the cost of sale, and access the millennials who we talked about earlier, who are sort of entering the industry. So let me just tell you what our website looks like. What we did let me just say one more word of our history, perhaps. We wanted 5 years ago, our idea was to launch a website a little bit like Expedia or Skyscanner or eDreams, where a shipper can come, put in an origin, put in a destination, 1 container, 5 containers, and compare prices and book online. That was always the vision. But we couldn't do that 5 years ago because none of the forwarders or the carriers had their prices instantly. And we thought that launching a website where you do a search and then it says, now wait 3 days for the results, would not be a compelling website. So we spent our first 4 years partnering with freight forwarders around the world and some carriers. And we now work with 1,000 freight forwarders around the world, including some of the bigger ones, including in some places your sister company, DB Schenker, to help them automate their price quotes. And based on that, after 4 years of collecting data, and again, there's no data standards in this industry, so we created a big factory for collecting Excel sheets. And we've collected literally tens of thousands of Excel sheets from around the world, and every day we add another 200 Excel sheets with rates from rail companies, air, ocean, trucking, port handling. So because there's no standard and we just read in these Excel sheets at a huge rate, you know. And as a result, we now launched a website where you can, it's a public website, you can put in an origin and destination. It's focused so far on US and UK, but we'll expand that soon, I believe, to Switzerland and other countries. And within a few seconds, you can see results from dozens of freight forwarders, and you can search and filter and book online. So that's our vision, to bring freight online. As I say, we're not trying to do it as disruptors. We're trying to do it in partnership with the existing freight carriers and the existing freight forwarders. In fact, like I said, we have 1,000 freight companies using our software, and you can see here the growth. This is the number of price quotes. It's now well over 100,000 this quarter. A number of price quotes which freight forwarders sent out using our software, so that's going very nicely. And then our actual website, where we allow people to book online, we allow freight forwarders to sell online, we allow shippers to book online, and that's here, we don't disclose the actual numbers, but that's the growth of the blue is new orders and the green is repeat orders. Yeah. So in conclusion, we feel that the time has come, the millennials coming to the industry expect instant online services, but also we're finding the freight carriers and the freight forwarders much more receptive than 2 or 3 years ago. There's a lot of understanding, I think, that it's time for this industry to modernize. The discussion this morning has confirmed that, and we're having fun partnering with the with the incumbent companies to help them to get their services online.
Thank you very much, Steve, everybody. Thank you. So when I looked at the Freightos website, I was struck by the testimonials on the holding page. Sexy was described, the service, an Expedia-like platform for freight, providing instant online real-time quoting. Freight quotas can take place in real time rather than the status quo of days. When do you think we'll be talking about the rail freight sector in this way? When can they make those claims?
Well, rail is part of what we do. So Freightos has a routing engine. So if you come to Freightos and say, I want to ship a container from Shanghai to, I would say Switzerland, but let's take as an example where I know better the actual data is, let's say Chicago. So we'll run a routing engine and we'll see all the options. It could come into, you could ship it from Shanghai to Los Angeles and then put it on a train to Chicago and then put it on a truck to the address. You could ship it through the Panama Canal to New York and then put it on a train or a truck. You can ship it through the Suez Canal and to New York and then put it on a train or a truck. And then if it's on a train, you still need a truck for the last mile. So we run a routing algorithm, a little bit like a Google Maps, where we check all of those options. And if rail is an efficient part of that, and it'll be the same in Europe, of course. If rail is part of the most efficient route to get it from A to B, then we absolutely include rail in that. But we're dependent in rail, as in ocean and air as well, we're dependent on the freight forwarders to give us the rates from the rail companies in an Excel sheet, instead of us talking to the rail company in real time and getting a price. So it's not as efficient as it could be. But we do get those rates in Excel, and we do sell multimodal routes, which often include rail.
You just mentioned it's not as efficient. Are your frustrations reducing as you get more and more into the industry, as you've got more time behind Freightos? Or is there something the industry can do? You've got a captive audience here to help you.
I think based on the discussion earlier, the industry knows what it needs to do, and it's not all that complicated. We need electronic APIs, as it's called, electronic connections, where we can get capacity, rates, booking, and tracking. And some bits of the industry have that. The US trucking, by the way, is the most advanced. So American trucking is where we do get rates and booking instantly electronically. But in rail, air, ocean, European trucking, we rarely get that. So I think the industry knows what's needed, and it's not all that complicated.
And just quickly, in terms of innovations, how much does something like augmented reality figure in your plans going forward?
Well, in terms of innovation, for us it's all about the data. It's all about collecting the data, and then also the data analytics. So big data is a big part of what we do. Once we do all the work to get all those thousands of Excels into a database, we certainly leverage that. So I think that's very interesting. And of course, a big potential innovation and a potential threat to rail is the driverless trucks, which we all know are coming.
And you mentioned about big data. I used to do conferences 3 or 4 years ago where big data was the key theme. It seems to have gone off the boil. Is it business as usual, big data now, or is it something we're just exploring at its infancy?
Or just small data now?
It's small data, yeah. Just like the dumb phones and the smartphones.
Both. I think it's business as usual in the sense that almost every company has some, big data nowadays and leverages that. But still, there's a lot more we can do with the data, so it's still developing. But it's.
And are you being smart with the data, do you think?
Well, one of the things that we do actually more on the ocean side right now is that we've launched an index to help people track. Ocean rates are changing daily. So we've launched an index to help shippers to track daily changes in ocean prices. So that's just one example of where we're using our data. But we do have, I think, now the world's biggest database of freight rates in all modes. So we're just beginning to explore everything that we can do and other people can do with that data.
Well, thank you very much for the time being. Steve Schreiber, everybody, thank you. Okay, so we've heard all 4 speakers present their thoughts and ideas. I've asked a couple of questions. I'm going to open to the floor in about 10, 15 minutes' time. But in the meantime, let's pick up on that point, Matthew, to begin with. The Commissioner said the rail freight industry needs to get its act together. What does she mean by that? And what can they do to get their act together?
Well, if I may, I'd like to come back to this rather surreal question, where is my train? Because I recall now that we heard from a guy at Antwerp who ran the Combinant terminal. And he has a very simple solution to the question of where his train is. He has a house near his terminal, and every time he sees the train coming towards his terminal from his house, he rings his staff and says the train's coming. It's sort of reminiscent of the Wild West. You can see the plume of smoke coming across the prairies.
Sounds good to me.
I don't want to be too sardonic about it, but this is the sort of level of what we're operating. Again, I'm encouraged. We are encouraged. The Commissioner's encouraged, because to take this thing, which is all around estimated time of arrival, there's now this group of intermodal operators who've come together to form ELATA, the electronic exchange of estimated time of arrival. And this basically is about pushing data between each other and making sure that, this isn't particularly, or shouldn't necessarily be cost-sensitive, commercially sensitive data. It's just about enabling the sector to make predictions, the things you're talking about, easier to do. So we really want to see that succeed. It's one of the 10 priorities the sector's committed itself to post-Rotterdam when we made this statement. And that's, I think that's a very good example of a practical thing we can do together, and we want to see it succeed.
I suppose in many ways people see data as a currency that's more valuable than energy or anything else at the moment. So how good is the industry at sharing data? Is that a stumbling block? What are your thoughts on that, Jürgen? How good are DB Cargo at sharing data so it helps the industry in general?
Yeah, I think that data, especially like I said, on intermodal logistics chains, they need to be shared in a certain controlled way, of course. I mean, if there is logistics partners or contractual partners or towards the next interface, then it's key that everybody gets those data basically in order to make predictions when in terms of tracking and tracing, when will be my shipment there. There's also a project going on that is called Kombinierterverkehr 4.0 with different partners. So in order to share all those data, I think that is important. Would I go as far as to say, well, all the data of each shipment from each customer needs to be publicly available? Probably not. Yeah? Some customers might have issues with that, but it needs to be available to serve the goal in order to better fulfill those logistics chains.
So an open exchange of data to properly collaborate with each other, is that possible if you are putting those controls in place, though?
Sorry, say that again?
To have a truly open exchange of data where the industry can collaborate with each other, is that possible if you're having to put those controls in? I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that is a goal. There's different initiatives on the way to do that, whether that is on also in the single wagon environment, on our production association, X-Rail or so, that are platforms where that can be shared in order to get a better tracking and tracing, which is the most important need of our customers.
And Peter, how would you feel about that open exchange of data?
Well, from one aspect, I'd be extremely concerned. I talked before about moving dangerous goods around my rail, which is obviously information that's important to us to do track and trace, but there are people out there in this world these days, as we've seen recently, terrorists, etc., that we certainly wouldn't want to have an open platform so that they could see where these materials are because of the potential misuse. So there's a certain dilemma there that we need the open sharing of certain data, but that we need platforms whereby people can see specific, their specific confidential data, but in a way that avoids us having to go out to many one-to-one connections. Like today already, many of our service providers have some sort of portal which you can go to and get certain information. But when you're a large company and you have a lot of different service providers, that actually doesn't do it for us, because that's a lot of time wasted going out to websites. We need to have ways of getting the data easily, but compartmentalizing it so that we protect the security of the data.
So with that in mind, Matthew, will that satisfy the concerns of the Commission in terms of getting the data exchange to move the industry forward?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we want to see the thing succeed on the terms of the sector has set for itself. I mean, to be very obvious about it, there have been difficulties over the time within the rail sector in having that kind of data exchange, and I'm very glad to hear Jürgen saying that you think that's moving forward. But it's essential for the sector to have some sort of intermodal exchange, because you will always require the last mile or the first mile. And so it will be very short-sighted if the sector can't move forward on this. I do take the point about dangerous goods. I do take the point about safety. But I think, as you also said, these are not issues which are foreign to the road sector and to the aviation sector. And so if they can deal with them, then we in the rail sector must be able to deal with them too.
And Steve, just to bring you in, when it comes to digitalisation as a central element of the supply chain, road is a tough competitor for rail, with forecasts of 25 to 30% lower costs for road over the next 10 years. So will truck platooning, automated driving and Uber-like platforms disrupt and truly make road transport much more efficient than rail, CO2 emissions aside?
Look, there are probably people in this room who are more expert on that than I am. But from what I can see, yes. I mean, with driverless trucks become a lot more efficient. They can drive for 24 hours. The cost of the driver, so that's instead of 8 hours, the cost of the driver is eliminated. And additionally, there is a potential for driverless trucks to convoy very close together and get some of the aerodynamic benefits that trains have. Because, obviously a person has a 1 or 2 seconds reaction time. So cars have to leave driver cars have to leave a gap. But driverless trucks could potentially drive extremely close together and get some of not all the benefits of rail, but some of the aerodynamic benefits of rail. And then they've got the benefit of the agility. They can drive point to point. So I think it's clear that the driverless trucks will pose a threat to the rail sector, except for very long haul. but on the where I assume rail will have an advantage for a long time.
But Patrick mentioned about those congested routes. He highlighted areas of the world. That's going to be to rail's favour, isn't it, going forward?
Yeah, correct. So congestion is one of the big threats of for driving. Although, of course, with with Waze and Google Maps, trucks are getting better at avoiding congestion. And there's a potential, again, that driverless trucks will get much closer together and increase the capacity of the roads. Plus, Elon Musk is busy boring tunnels underneath. So I don't know better than anyone else whether they'll catch up with they'll keep up with the congestion or not. So, but that's certainly rail has some advantages as well. I'm just saying that relatively the driverless trucks will add a little bit to the competitiveness of trucking, or maybe more than a little bit.
Yep, fair comment. Jürgen, rail freight requires heavy public investment if rail is going to be fit for the future. So what needs to happen first? The updating of the physical infrastructure, or do you need to just get on with the digital transformation and let the physical infrastructure catch up when it can? Or is that not possible because then you don't realise the full benefits of digital transformation if the physical infrastructure is not right in the first place?
It's not an either or. It needs to be both at the same time. There's no other way. I mean, if we totally neglect the physical infrastructure, then we wouldn't reap those efficiency gains, like, for example, the 740-meter trains that needs changes to physical infrastructure, and which is key towards costs of road, as we learned this morning, going further down 25 or 30%. Some people even say more, 40% or something like that. We cannot put those ideas on the side. We need to do both. Both are necessary in order to have a good and a great chance to catch up with the development on the road. There's no question for me.
And Peter, we've got a captive audience here. Matthew, we've glued him to the seat. What do you think is the role of regulators and authorities? What would you like them to do?
Be nice.
Yeah. Don't be nice.
I think it's quite clear from many of the comments how fragmented Europe still is, and it's maybe a bit strange for the audience listening to Brits talking about this right now, but it's quite clear that we've got a very fragmented setup, which is leading to a lot of inefficiencies, which as a shipper has a major impact, and ultimately actually from an environmental, social perspective has a lot of impact too. And so the specifics of that I leave to the other experts, but somehow actually creating more of a common setup across the region, without even tackling the border with Russia and the different rail gauge over there. I mean, like that's maybe a step too far. But within the European region, we should be able to come a lot further, a lot quicker in terms of harmonisation, and that would have a major benefit.
And in terms of the discussion around updating the physical infrastructure, how much of a concern is that to you at Dow? And what impact will that have on digitalisation if investment is not put in right? I mean, you've seen a wonderful example in Switzerland of a tunnel that works and that was open last year,
right,
and is state of the art, and yet it's connecting to other areas that aren't quite so state of the art.
There's a bit of a duality in the world where you're dealing with those two issues side by side. Maybe one specific example, through the German Chemical Association, and working with colleagues from other companies, and through that association, we've been working to highlight in Germany where there are specific infrastructure problems that are really having a major effect on us, whether that's the Autobahn network or rail bridges, etc., to try and encourage the investment that is there in the infrastructure to be targeted towards some of those key difficulties. And it's maybe a role that shippers can play. And we obviously we're not so directly involved in the hands-on details here, but just by adding our voice to the discussion and, as I say, trying to prioritize those types of investments and point out the impact that has on all of us. That's a key thing. Now, to your other point, yes, it's a major. We talk about the digital age and how fast that's going, but then on the physical analog age, kind of being stuck in the last century to some extent.
And Matthew, I'm going to bring you in, and then I'm going to open up to the floor. So if we get the microphones ready. Matthew, you had a point.
Well, I just wanted to thank Peter for his support for integration, but also for putting it in a practical perspective. There are plenty of ideological believers in integration. We in the Commission are not. We're trying to do it to bring the practical benefits. Just let's take the example of the ERTMS, which is the way we can get greater efficiency, greater cost savings without compromising safety, which everyone wants. It only will work and only be effective in Europe if we can do it on a pan-European scale. And to take the example of the generally successful Rhine-Alpine corridor, it's at the cross-border points, 2 cross-border points between Germany and the Netherlands, where we're not yet there. Another example, these 740-meter trains, these were differences. The Belgians saying, well, there's not much point in us doing it if the Germans aren't going to do it. So the ministers have got together in Leipzig, another use for the ITF conference in Leipzig. They've got together in Leipzig and they've agreed. But that's what's necessary. I don't care how it happens. It doesn't have to happen because of Commission fiat. The best thing is if the sector does it and agrees to do it on an integrated basis. But that's the only way rate will survive in Europe.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So do you have a question for our panellists? I'm going to bring in Patrick as well at some point, just to get his thoughts on that, because he talked about emotion and trust, and we've mentioned it a little bit, but we sort of scantily mentioned it rather than actually dived into it, what impact that has on the industry. So I just wanted to see from the audience point of view. You have to wave furiously at me, because as it is my 50th anniversary, my eyesight, as Patrick's pointed out, is going downhill as well. So I put conditioner on my hair when it should be shampoo as well. So hands up if you have a question for one of our panel. Is there an area that maybe we haven't discussed that you think, as a gentleman there, hello there, we'll get the microphone to you. If you can just keep your hand up. And I'm going to have to get our ladies to run, I'm afraid, if you don't mind. So we have to, it's good keep fit. Hello there. And if you can quickly introduce yourself to everybody.
My name is Bernd Menzinger. I have been many years ago the chairman of Hupac, and I know the history of the company.
I think everybody knows you here then.
All of you have not addressed a key issue, and this is you are talking about rail freight and infrastructure and systems. We are not talking about the fight between cargo and passenger traffic. And how are you going to solve this? All of you.
Okay, who wants to take that first? Matthew. I'm being mean to you today.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, to let you into a dirty secret, it's not the Commission taking those decisions. We are trying to have a less fractured environment for the taking of those decisions. I recognize that to some extent it's a zero-sum game. We can do that with better data. We can do that with better digitalization. We can do that with better systems. At the end, I also recognize that at the margin there may be political choices to be made and commercial choices to be made. And so we will look, I'd be very interested to hear Deutsche Bahn's view about how it manages internally between passenger and cargo data. I mean, it's a good problem to have because it implies that the capacity that we have is being fully used. And I'm not sure we're quite at that point. If we really succeed, that will become a very tough question.
Steve, I know you're nodding your head there.
No, I was just agreeing. I don't know anything about this, but when I go for a walk here, the rail tracks seem fairly empty, so I don't know that we've reached, but I'm not an expert, but just visually from the outside, it doesn't look like we're at capacity where we have to choose between them, but I may be wrong.
Jürgen.
Yeah, I mean, you're fully right.
Freight's more important, right?
That is a big issue, of course, also within Deutsche Bahn, right? There's a constant discussion going on at construction sites or who gets priority. People from freight business say if they run a passenger train, I've seen tons of freight trains on the side while passenger trains could go by. If you ask different perspectives of people sitting in the train, they might have other perspectives on that. So it's a difficult thing. I think what we and we are in the process, first of all, in our project Future Rail to measure impacts, for example, of construction sites on passenger trains and also on freight trains. And we need to come to a metric, for example, to balance out those needs. And then, if I give you another example, is if we talk about construction sites. And this year we have quite a few construction sites in the infrastructure, and in the coming 2 years we will have still a lot of construction sites in the infrastructure. We need to make conscious decisions and balance it out, whether the priority is being on time, which refers more to the passenger trains, or whether it is, while doing construction work, to maintain a certain capacity to get a throughput for the freight trains. And there's different, let's say, measurements to those. It cannot be in the future that the one has, let's say, a priority over the other. They need to be transformed, let's say, into one currency, and then making decisions what to spend maybe additional money on construction sites in order also to adequately maintain capacity, which is so important for passenger freight trains. And that is a big discussion that is going on right now, in Germany at least. And I think that is a very important discussion and also a promising discussion that could become a little better. Will that problem totally go away? No.
Peter, anything to add?
I'm with the questioner. You guys should sort
Yeah.
it out.
Yeah.
But,
I like that
In
response.
favour of freight,
the
right?
only thing I would add is you just have to look to other examples. So you think about busy airports. They manage to land a plane every 90 seconds safely. So there are many other examples, many things. I'm sure it's fixable.
Indeed. Okay. Has that answered your question? And we've covered it now. Tick. There we go. Anybody else from the audience? I know one of the questions that Hans-Jörg, you mentioned in your intro, who will disrupt the $250 billion logistics business? I think that was one of the questions that you raised. So while we may be lining somebody else up in the audience, who is going to disrupt it? Will it be the likes of Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook? Or is there somebody else coming along?
I think that's a realistic possibility. The data, the supply chain capabilities that an Amazon or an Alibaba or you name it have, that step by step they can apply that into other industries outside of the consumer space because they have that capability. I think it's a real threat to people that are distributors, traders, intermediaries in the system that these guys could quite easily move in if they choose to.
And on that note, when it just comes to disruption, is there an element of cannibalization that the likes of Hupac and other people in the audience need to do to themselves in order not to be extinct going forward?
I think Hans-Jörg mentioned this before, that if you have some assets, infrastructure, equipment, or you produce something, then you have something that the digital world needs anyway. However, if we don't respond to the threat of technology or Amazon coming into the chemical distribution market, if we don't respond to that, then our role in the marketplace is going to change. I don't think we're going to like the outcome. So I do think companies like ourselves, and I guess for all of us, we need to respond and find the right way to adapt and use the technology and be part of that change rather than have the change enforced on us.
Matthew, I want you to say
Well,
something.
I just
Maybe
think-
throw in about mindset as well.
Well, exactly what I wanted to say. I mean, I totally agree with Peter, but isn't it interesting how the use of language has changed? When I was a kid in school, Nadine, the disruptive kid was the one who was sent to the back of the class, and then if he carried on, he was sent to the headmaster, and then he was suspended from school. Now he's celebrated as an icon of change. It's a similar, I blame the Americans, actually. The other word is aggression. Aggressive behavior is now celebrated as someone who's really goal-oriented and going for things. But I think that does reflect the nature of the world we live in and the need to adapt to these incredibly fast periods of change.
Okay. So any other questions from the audience? Anybody else? There's a gentleman there. We need to get the microphone. These couple of rows are very lively, aren't they? That's a very good row to be in to ask questions. Here we go. We're going to get the microphone passed to you. And again, if you just wouldn't mind introducing yourself, People may know you in the audience, but in case they don't, hello
My
there.
name is Jan Arnett, working at Berchi. I have a question to Mr. Schreiber. Sure, you did your considerations already on track and trace, how to implement it also on your platform. How would you do that? How would you organize that amongst your source of data providers?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Track and trace is a huge headache for us, as it is for everyone else, because what happens is people buy a freight service on our website from a freight forwarder or a carrier, so they want to ship something from China to Switzerland or whatever. And there's almost an expectation when you buy something online, as people said before, that you're going to be able to track and trace it online. And our ability to do that now is quite limited. So we're working hard to talk to the carriers in all the modes and the freight forwarders to try to get updates of where the stuff is, where the train is, where the plane is, well, first, where the container is, which train or plane or truck it's on, and then where is the plane or train or truck or ship. And that's an ongoing process. I mean, if there was some sort of open standard, it would be much quicker. But in the meantime, we're doing it the hard way. We're talking one at a time to forwarders and carriers and saying, get us the data anyway. It could be by email, and we'll find a way to get it onto our website.
Has that answered your question? Great question. Patrick, can I bring you in? If we can get Patrick's microphone up, just your thoughts on what you've heard.
What's really interesting is to start bringing together the various elements we've heard about. So, for instance, we've been hearing a lot about automated trucks. We've been hearing a lot about the challenge of getting trucks onto trains and how expensive it is to get them on the train and get them off. So I've been starting to imagine a world, if you can imagine convoys of automated trucks driving around the streets here, and they drive themselves to the local freight yard without a single human being involved. They know which wagon to load themselves onto, and they actually drive themselves directly up onto the wagons. No human beings involved at all. A completely automated world. The other thing I've been struck by is the challenges we've got on the network. Let's apply the two things we've been hearing each other say. On the one hand, we've been hearing trucks can nosy up to each other front to back, and they can accelerate. You get massive improvement in the throughput of traffic down a motorway. On the same thing, we're saying we can't get any freight on our lines because every 30 seconds there's a massive passenger train comes thundering down, so we have to stay in the siding till the middle of the night. Well, there's two answers to that. One technical, and I don't understand whether we can do it or not. Why on earth can't we speed up these freight trucks, and freight trains? And the answer is probably they're too heavy, in which case, why can't we make them smaller and sharper and slit them in the slipstream of passenger trains? In other words, and we put many, many more passenger trains down the track with automatic braking systems front and back, which are just as clever as the ones we're starting to put on the robots. One robot truck in front of another robot truck, in front of another robot truck with only half a meter behind them. Why on earth can't we have trains with only, let's say, 50 meters between one entire express train and another? Now, it should not. We have the technology to do these things. We've got compartmentalized innovations going on. I'm just saying in rail and in road, but we're talking about intermodal. When we bring these things together, and what I love about what you're doing, that's precisely what you're doing with Freightos. I made a note of that website. I'm desperately going to look at it. I'm going to tweet it all over the place. I think it's a really interesting type of the future. And it's a kind of platform that you could start doing the things we talked about, like filling those empty tracks, doing the product exchanges at the same time. There's all kinds of places where your platform could go. So I thought it was very interesting.
Thank you.
But we are going to need the regulation as well. And there has to be some tax advantages, I believe, to make people do the thing which is morally right.
Thank
when
you,
it comes to
Patrick.
environment.
Yes, thank you.
As
I'm
Switzerland
glad
has
you've
done.
been paying attention. That's brilliant. Thank you for that intervention. And Matthew, on that note about the regulations, the tax, and the idea that he's come up with, I know there's a bit of murmuring in the audience as to whether this is possible or not.
I think the audience should murmur more loudly because they'll know more than I as to whether that's viable or not. But I had the privilege of sitting next to Patrick last night, and he made a very good point that actually we sometimes over-anticipate the amount of change that there's going to be. And in 20 years' time, the world might look rather similar to the way it does now. And I think when we talk about automation, that may in fact be a case. So to all those people who are terrified that because there's less gain to be made from automation in the rail business against the truck business, it might not be going as fast as you can. That's the good news. The bad news is, in the short term, there's a lot more that can be done to catch up in the short term on the digitalization aspects, and to actually, and I do really honestly believe, from everything I've heard, that the rail freight sector is behind and is not reaping the benefits it could from this much more basic part of the information revolution. Let's make the changes and the productivity gains that can come from digitalization first before we worry too much about automation.
Jürgen, is that practical to do?
Yeah, I mean, we need, as I said before, I mean, digitalization is something that is really vital for us, and I think we can do on a certain timeline, make great progress that we haven't seen in the past. Absolutely
And the ideas
right.
that Patrick was raising about the size.
Oh, the size, and basically, you can think rail in a totally different way, totally extreme, if you would go to, and there is a lot of considerations on that, but of course hasn't been implemented where you could think of individual rail cars that are individually driven, steered through the network, fully automated. But that is something where the infrastructure today, as we have it, is not there to do that as a freight operator, because that needs to be much more automated than it is today.
Okay. I'm conscious of time. What I'm going to do now is get each of my panelists up here to do sort of 30 seconds, 45 seconds each soundbite as the key points. It may have changed from the opening statement, and you're welcome to share, I say use other people's points of view that have come from the audience or from other speakers that you think are the salient points. And I'm going to end on you, Matthew, so I'm going to start down that end. So just 30 to 45 seconds of what you'd like the audience to think about when they leave this wonderful anniversary celebration and go back to wherever to start thinking differently for the next 50 years.
Well, did you say the next 50 years?
Well, next year.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. I'm using it as a hook.
Think how much, I mean, this is the one point where the only point where maybe I don't exactly agree with Matthew in the sense that I think the world has changed a lot in the last 20 years, right? Remember 20 years ago, there were no smartphones. You had to go to the travel agent to book a ticket. You had to go to the library to find information. I mean, it was a very different world 20 years ago, and I think it will change even more in the next 10 or 20 years. 50, I can't even imagine what will be happening. So I think big changes are happening. I think the rail industry needs to change faster, and I think it can. I think despite there are challenges that Jürgen said correctly, but I think it's possible to have driverless trains and more dynamic networks, and maybe it's a significant investment, but I think it's a required investment if rail will stay competitive with the big changes that are happening in road.
And it will survive.
Modes. And then I think there's a good potential to survive if there's those adaptations. Yeah.
Okay, Jürgen, same to you.
I think there's a few key points. First of all, there is huge potential in automation and digitalization, as we have heard. We need to bring that forward. We need to do that as rail operators. We need to capture those opportunities as we sit in this room. We need to not forget that we also need to do further investments on the infrastructure. Yeah, I'm glad for that question. It needs to be done both at the same time. Once we have done our homework, so to say, as a sector, we need also support for political frame conditions in Europe for rail freight. I'm totally convinced about that. I think those are the points we need to take home.
Thank you, Jürgen. Peter?
I think the key point for me is that this is actually a really critically important discussion. In the broader sense, if we take my industry, we are a supplier to just about every industry out there. So this is an issue of competitiveness and the future of industry and manufacturing in the region. It's critically important that we maintain that competitiveness versus the outside world and continue to lead in many, many ways in terms of industry. And I think making this happen is a great opportunity. And I think both at the bigger level and small scale, there's just so many opportunities for efficiency through digitalization and other things. So it's very exciting.
Thank you, Peter. Matthew?
I very much agree with what Peter just said. Rail freight can be the future, and the world will be a better place if it is, for all sorts of reasons. It risks being the past, and the next 15 years will be absolutely critical to its future. What you are doing in Hupac with intermodal development show how much can be done in terms of change and challenging the existing models and making things work better. And we, in the Commission, more generally in the EU, are absolutely ready to help, both in terms of regulation, the fourth railway package, driving competition, improving intermodality and interoperability, I should have said, and in terms of investment. We're putting our money where our mouth is through the CEF, through the new investment fund projected by Juncker. But at the end, it comes down to the sector. Can the sector change? Can the sector make it work?
And just a promotion again, next year's an important year because...
Year of multimodality.
And we're all invited
I've
to
got
the
to work at
party, apparently. Well, thank you very much to our panellists. If you remain seated on stage, but big round of applause, please, to all our panellists.